Greetings, hello, wherever you are. We're wishing you a great hello from Rochester, New York. I'm Richard Dolan. This is my beautiful wife, Tracey.
Oh, thanks. Hi.
This is Intelligent Disclosure. How are you? Hoping you're doing well. You really can't answer, so I don't know why I just asked you.
Yes, they can. They can answer in the chat.
Tracy's a little miffed at me because of a mishap that just happened. Would you like to explain?
Okay, so I walk in the room and there's this smell and I'm thinking, this is usually not you, but I was like, God, I'm gonna have to ask him, like, did you take your shoes off? Because it's like really strong. Richard's been working around the house inside, outside all day. So I thought maybe,
Well, the answer is yes, but that's not the relevant point here. That's not the relevant point. And we can explain why.
He reveals he has just spilt something.
Correct.
And I'm thinking it can't be something you spilt, with the smell. So anyways.
But it was.
But it was. So I don't know if there's any fans out there of this. Richard is obsessed with kombucha.
The magic of kombucha. It's as if you took the distinct aroma of dirty socks, but somehow made it delicious. You would call it kombucha. So it's like dirty socks. You got that, but it's the kind you like. And that's what we call kombucha.
Usually I just tease him about it. I cannot drink it. I just can't stand the smell or the taste. People either love it or they hate it.
She is right. It's kind of an obsession. I drink it a lot.
He is obsessed with the stuff. But
I enjoy it.
My God, it's true. That when I walked in here, it was oh my God.
It was a fresh little mishap, and so unavoidable.
Yeah.
And there we go.
All right. Well, it's all cleaned up now. There's a lovely aroma.
So it says hated it. Well, haters gonna hate, but I'm just telling you.
I don't like it, but
this stuff is dope, man. It's the best.
Yeah, completely.
So shall we segue into our theme for the evening?
Yes, I know we don't usually do this, but I just want to say thank you to Mike, because everybody who comes every week knows you're such a big supporter of us. And that's just so generous. And you're a member as well. And we're happy to have you as a member.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike.
We just want to give you a quick thank you because we saw that. We're not supposed to be watching the chat right now, but we couldn't help it.
I normally have it blocked. That's the truth, because like when I'm talking, I've got notes, I've got whatever, and I don't like to see the chat because it can be distracting, but we haven't really jumped in. And really a greeting to everyone and all of our supporters. It's always very important.
Yeah.
For us, I mean, this is what keeps us being able to do what we do. So thank you. Now, shall we jump into our theme of crash retrievals?
Yes. So I just want to say I am super excited you decided to do this, because I would say just about every week in the chat, somebody says this. It's sometimes it's new people. I don't know. But if we have extraterrestrials here that are so advanced, how is it freaking possible that there are crashes?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are they crashing? So this comes up almost every week. And
absolutely. It's a valid question to ask. Mm-hmm. Someone wrote a very long and I thought a very thoughtful discourse on that exact theme in our last live stream when we talked about the breakaway civilization. And I have his name in my notes here, and I'll mention him actually. Is Robert Hawes. And Robert, if you're listening, I want to try to address what you have to say on this. But yeah, I mean, what you're asking is totally reasonable. Like, we want to think, why, if they're even, whatever they are, they clearly have very advanced technology. Why do they seem to be such nincompoops?
Right. Yes.
And we keep
whatever they are.
collecting their technology and bodies. Okay. Well, I would like to deal with that, as well as a number of other things about the truth about UFO crash retrievals.
I just want to say, too, for those of us who do believe that there's something going on, this is one of the things that the skeptics always come at us with. So it's another reason why I'm really glad.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure other people are, too, that you're
most definitely
dealing with this. And, that will help us deal with talking to skeptics, because it is a very fair question, So.
Yeah, totally agree. So,
all right, you ready to get into it?
I believe I am. So,
okay.
I think you're going to be right over yonder.
I am.
If I need you, I'm going to call you. I'm going to ask for your help.
Perfect.
And we'll just mosey on back anytime.
Yep. I
But this is not a large office. This is a very small little space we got here.
It's true.
So I'm
It's true.
gonna slide. I'm gonna
And
slide
I can
over
see
when
there's
you move.
lots of people here, and thanks so much for joining, everyone. It's really cool to have you all, and it's really cool, by the way, to hear where you guys are from. It's just really fun to see that in the chat where everybody's signing in from. So, anyways, we'll see you in a sec.
All right, I'm gonna miss you.
I'm right here.
I'm gonna go here. I guess we're in a kind of a spunky mood tonight, apparently. So there you go.
There's a lot going on.
Well, I'm going to talk about something that's actually a serious topic, even though it's the subject of a great deal of levity in the popular mass culture that we live in. I mean, my God, it's just the subject of endless comedic themes and so on. But that is a subject that actually is a real thing, and it's UFO crash retrievals. It's something I've been studying for as long as I've been studying UFOs. I've been studying this phenomenon, and I am, yes, convinced that it is a absolutely real thing. But as Tracey was just asking, like, why are there crashes at all? And well, I would like to deal with that as I move through this subject. But I will just actually, I'm pulling up the letter from Robert Hawes from about a week ago. This is from our live stream on the Breakaway Civilization. At least I'm pretty sure that was the one. And again, it was a very thoughtful letter, but it was also something that we encounter quite a lot in this field, this type of question. So Robert just asked first, why are there UFO crashes in the first place? Crashes are understandable with our rather flimsy aircraft. Actually, what I normally hear is that, our commercial airline industry is so incredibly safe. So are we better than the aliens? And I want to get to that as well. But he goes on, he says, with such a presumably radically advanced technology capable of maybe interstellar travel or interdimensional flight, how do they appear to crash so relatively often? And he's essentially asking, so why that? And then why are there some claims that are just simply disinformation to hide our own exotic technology? He asked specifically what I might think of Dr. Joseph Farrell's conclusion, at least at an earlier point in his research. I'm not sure what Joe thinks today about Roswell specifically and the result of exotic tech derived from Nazis after the Second World War. And then his final question is, given that these others can see how violent we are, why do they allow us to get their tech at all? Why don't they warn abductees about the various violent human governments and the dangerous tech that governments have? I guess I'll just deal with that one very quickly before I jump into the topic. First of all, I guess a lot of these questions, and I'm not singling Robert out here. I mean, again, it's a perfectly reasonable thing. But we're really dealing with questions that are speculative rather than investigative. So that's the first thing I would want to point out. And it's not simply about crash retrievals. It's about the extraterrestrial phenomenon in general. Why would they travel all the way here to visit us? And why would they abduct human beings for their particular purposes? And why don't they just announce themselves? And why don't they, in other words, why don't they behave the way that we think that they should behave? Is always the question that we're asking. And they're always theoretical questions. They're always speculative. And while I can appreciate that, and I think we all should be asking these types of questions, I also think it's important to keep in mind that those should, in my view anyway, be secondary to the actual data that we have, the actual investigations that we have, which do actually indicate a number of crash retrievals. In fact, I have a book here. I was gonna get into this a little later. This is by my friend Ryan Wood, called Magic Eyes Only, Earth's Encounters with Extraterrestrial Technology, forward by my old friend Jim Mars. Anyway, Ryan put this book out, oh gosh, more than 10 years ago. And I like this book a lot. He delineates what he believes are 75 candidates for UFO crash retrieval. I'm going to show you, there's the table of contents right there. That is actually 75 cases. And what I also like about how he went through this book is he has his own kind of standard of gauging how valid or how strong the case is. So if it's just average, he tells you, and if he thinks it's a strong case, he'll tell you that. So anyway, he has 75 cases altogether, and of the cases that he can personally consider strong, I think that number is 17. Matter of fact, I think he was actually wrong on a few and should have included them as well. I would put the number at least closer to 20, but that's just my assessment. Point is, though, that there are a number of these cases where it seems like there's a genuine recovery of a UFO, and that means technology and bodies. So again, we're left with, my God, could it actually be 20 cases of these things going down? And one of the questions that Robert asked in that statement of his is, what about Joseph Farrell's conclusion about Roswell, that this was the result of Nazi tech? I'm going to get into Roswell in just a moment. My quick answer is I don't think it was Nazi tech. I think there are reasons to have wondered, were the Nazis or the Nazi scientists involved in Roswell? And it's not an absolutely impossible case, but I think that in order to make it, you have to eliminate a great mass of the testimony that we have. In other words, you only come to that conclusion by cherry picking the data. So that's my quick answer. But now, I'm not going to answer yet why are there crashes at all. I'm going to come back to that at the end of this live stream. What I would like to talk about at the moment, as to way of getting into this, is to look at a little bit of the evidence, and let's just call it for what it is, testimony. But testimony from some very highly credible, sober-minded, careful researchers and public figures. And all of these people, I'm just going to mention some of their names. So we have a great deal of research from the late Leonard Stringfield, one of the best UFO researchers we've ever had. He died in the 1990s. A very interesting statement from several statements, actually, from former Senator Barry Goldwater, one-time presidential candidate. Statement from a man named Dr. Robert Sarbacher, another from Dr. Eric Walker. Even a statement from Bob Lazar, I think, is important. The late Ben Rich, former head of Lockheed Skunkworks, figures into this. I may want to talk a little bit about Colonel Philip Corso briefly. And certainly I want to bring in my late friend, Dr. Edgar Mitchell of Apollo 14. Let me get Goldwater first. I mean, Barry Goldwater, again, was a longtime Republican senator of Arizona who ran for the presidency in 1964, was soundly defeated by Lyndon Johnson, but was not simply a longtime senator and a powerful man, but he was a general in the U.S. Air Force Reserve. And he was a very close friend, actually, of Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, a guy who is a legend in the Air Force, cigar-chomping guy who was one of the very great planners of the Pacific campaigns of World War II. And Goldwater spoke a number of times, actually, about his attempt to talk to Curtis LeMay about gaining access to what was called the Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And this was the room where, at least as it was said at the time, where it was believed that alien bodies were being stored. Now, we're talking back in the 1970s when this happened. And so you really have to ask yourself, like, how would Goldwater even then be getting the rumors that there were bodies at Wright-Pat that early? He was. It's possible that it was even as early as the late 1960s. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure exactly what year he tried to get access to this. But he did state several times that he did try to get access to it, and stated that LeMay, who again was such a close friend of his, so one time in their friendship, LeMay got very, very stern, almost angry with Goldwater, and just said, "Don't ever ask me to do that again." And I get the impression from Goldwater that LeMay probably used some colorful language in the process. Goldwater, in a letter to one constituent who asked about this, just said, "This thing has gotten so highly classified, even though I will admit there's a lot that has been released." He was talking about freedom of information data that was coming out at that time. Nevertheless, he said, it is just impossible to get anything on it. So despite the fact that we were getting some documents, he says, on this matter, he said, forget about it. It's not going to happen. That's Barry Goldwater. And that's not, again, proof of crash retrievals, but it is certainly indicative. I mean, he seemed certainly to believe that there were alien bodies at Wright Pat. In terms of Stringfield's research, I just want to mention this very briefly. Leonard Stringfield, back in the late 70s, published a book in 1977 called Situation Red, the UFO Siege, and it was really the beginning of what we can call the crash retrieval era, in that, from the time of Roswell, 1947, through the late 70s, for about 30 years, UFO researchers and the UFO public were not talking about crash retrievals at all. This was not a theme, not in the least. But it was something that was very quietly moving below the surface level, as it were, some quiet conversations and so on. Stringfield became interested and actually just started quietly to investigate this. In his book in 1977, that section on crash retrievals was simply one chapter of an entire book, but in it he discussed a number of cases that looked like UFO crash retrievals that actually happened. It was a very outrageous, not strident, but a very shocking claim at the time. Researchers looked at crash retrievals the way they looked at the 1950s contactees, as like crazy town. Crash retrievals, you've got to be kidding me. But Stringfield collected a number of these. One of the stories that he collected, by the way, was he actually did kind of bump into the Roswell case, but he also helped open up a story of a crash before Roswell, and that is what is now well-known apparent crash at Cape Girardeau in Missouri in April of 1941, early, before the American entry into World War II, as a matter of fact. And that case actually became very interesting. It involved a deathbed confession to a woman named Charlotte Mann from her grandmother. I actually happened to meet Charlotte Mann, and I can just tell you, you're not going to find a more conscientious and I think a good witness or a good person to give testimony in this. She's a very upstanding individual, that's obvious. Stringfield looked into this a bit, but as the case opened up in years later, turns out that her grandfather was named William Huffman. So she got this from her grandmother, who was married to her grandfather, obviously. And William Huffman was brought in to pray over crash victims outside of town, outside of Cape Girardeau. Police, FBI, emergency crew personnel were there. There was a strange craft with hieroglyphic type of writings on it, and not much more information than that. It's kind of receded back in time. Nevertheless, I give the Cape Girardeau crash a probable thumbs up in terms of the fact that I think it happened. Let me talk a little bit about Roswell, just to give you a little bit of the timeline. I think this is actually quite interesting. The Roswell crash happened in July of 1947, and as far as we can tell now, here's how the timeline went down. On Saturday, July 5th, 1947, was the discovery by a sheep herder about 75 miles north of Roswell, New Mexico. Now, if you've ever been out to that area, as I have, you go north of Roswell, I can tell you there's not a lot of anything out there. It is big, enormous, not the most hospitable terrain to live on. You can live out there, people do, but it's not easy. You got to be tough out there, and there's a whole lot of nothing, particularly in 1947. Population was even less than it is now, and it's still not that high out in that area. So there was a sheep herder named Mac Brazel. He was foreman of a ranch known as the Foster Ranch. That was a family that owned the property, and he finds this debris on July 5th. It was metal, plastic-like beams, lightweight material, foil, famously very, very, very tough foil that you couldn't tear, you couldn't you couldn't damage it in any way. And this string-like material, not string, but string-like material. This was all unusually lightweight and unusually strong, according to Brazel. He shows his nearest neighbor. They were named the Proctors. He brings the debris to the Roswell sheriff, a man named George Wilcox. Wilcox sends a couple of deputies to, they never made it, by the way, but to go to the debris site because it is super remote. They did come back and say they found a field of melted glass. That's interesting. So Wilcox decides to call the Roswell Army Air Force Base. This is just before the Air Force becomes an independent branch of the U.S. military, still part of the Army. And in charge of that base was Colonel William Blanchard. He's the commanding officer of the 509th Bomber Group. These are the guys famously who dropped the nuclear atomic bombs on Japan. Okay, they had the famous plane, the Enola Gay. That was the 509th. They were certainly one of the most elite military units in the world at that time. So, and at the same time, so Wilcox does all of this. He contacts Blanchard on July 6th. That's a Sunday. On July 7th, Monday, there's a surprise trip to New Mexico by three-star General Nathan Twining. He was head of Air Material Command, who flew to New Mexico, stayed there until July 11th. It's funny, people looked into this and they said, oh no, well, he had a conference to attend. I'm like, no. He went to Roswell. Everything was going down in Roswell at that particular time. And so on the very same day, Blanchard's team arrives at the debris field, and this is Captain Jesse Marcel, who was the head of intelligence of the 509th Bomber Unit, along with Sheridan Cavett of CIC, that's counterintelligence, and William Rickett, also counterintelligence officer. So,
excuse me.
Okay there?
Mm-hmm.
All righty.
All good.
So Mac Brazel takes Jesse Marcel and Sheridan Cavett to the debris field, and this Rickett stays behind. So that they find the debris field. It's 3/4 of a mile long. It's about 200 or 300 feet wide. There's a gouge in the ground about 500 feet long. There is debris there. It's as thin as newsprint, but incredibly strong, just as Brazel had described. One soldier actually later told Jesse Marcel that it was unbendable, even by a sledgehammer. Foil, when you crumble it up, would return to its shape without leaving any wrinkles, and so on. And then there were I-beams with odd symbols. They were pink or maybe a lavender in color. You could flex them a tiny bit. They would not break. Those are the beams. As a matter of fact, Jesse Marcel was so impressed by all of this, so he spends the day collecting as much as he could, putting it back in the Jeep. He goes back and he ends up stopping off alone in the middle of the night, stops off at his house, finally gets back, wakes up his family. I think it's 2 a.m. now on early Tuesday morning, wakes them up, shows his family, including his 11-year-old son, Jesse Jr. Anyone who's been in the UFO field and gotten to meet Jesse Jr., who's recently died a couple of years ago, can see what measure of man he was. Jesse Jr. was a man of total integrity, ended up becoming a doctor and a colonel in the United States Army himself, did several tours getting on in years overseas. He was a heck of a guy. Anyway, so Jesse Marcel Jr., 11 years old at this time, sees the debris. And very, very strongly impressed all of them. And his dad's like, this is from a flying saucer, guys, take a look. So Jesse Marcel brings the debris back to Blanchard's office at the at Roswell Army Airfield. Blanchard, meanwhile, this is all Tuesday morning now, notifies the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, and orders Jesse Marcel to bring the debris there. At the same time, imagine how incredible this had to be. Roswell Army Airfield makes an announcement to the world. You know, it's easy for us to forget this when people like to debunk Roswell. Just a weather balloon, just a mogul balloon apparatus, whatever. Just dummies that the Air Force was dropping from high altitude, whatever. The fact is that Colonel Blanchard authorized the issue of a press release from his from Walter Haut, Lieutenant Walter Haut, who was the press officer of the base, and they state the intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group, at Roswell Army Airfield announced at noon today that the field has come into possession of a flying saucer. They went there. They said it. It made headlines for a few hours until it was pulled. Meanwhile, Marcel's going to Fort Worth, Texas. He arrives there. Well, we were told through the deceased witness known as Pappy Henderson. This is from his, I believe, his spouse after he died. But he was ordered actually to fly that aircraft at very low altitude after they put a unspecified thing in there that was believed to be a body. And the point about having to fly low is that they didn't have a highly pressurized situation there, at least in the cargo, and they did not want to damage whatever it was they were flying. This is a very important flight, incidentally. Anyway, Marcel arrives. He's at Ramey's office, head of the 8th Air Force, and they pose for pictures. You've seen the pictures. This poor Jesse Marcel made to look like an idiot holding debris of a weather balloon. And that was the orders. And years later, he made that very, very explicit. He said, they switched the material. And I was made to pose with this material. And what I actually went in there was not what we were posing with. So I think that's very interesting. And then, of course, the headlines go out. The New York Times, which can always be relied on to do the heavy lifting for the national security state, then as now, all their job is to serve as the mouthpiece of the establishment. They are our Pravda. They announced, and immediately after that, it was just a weather balloon, people. Nothing to see here. Keep moving along. Marcel is discovered in 1978 by Stanton Friedman. Stan's just doing a lecture down in, I think, New Orleans or in that area where Marcel was living in retirement. Maybe it was Baton Rouge. Can't remember. And someone comes up and says, "Oh, you want to talk about UFOs? I got someone for you." And the rest was history. They wrote a book, and there you go. And of course, that started a great deal of additional research by people like Kevin Randall, Don Schmidt, Stanton Friedman. Did a lot of follow-up, writing a variety of books with different variations on the theme. And I don't want to get into all the details here. Don't need to. The fact is that a great amount of testimony was uncovered through these Roswell researchers, more than enough to show that, yes, it certainly appears that there were bodies and there was highly exotic technology that were recovered at the crash site, and that was considered so important that the United States military had to lie about it, or felt they had to lie about it for many, many years to come. So that's the bare bones of the Roswell story, and it's really an amazing story. And despite the fact that it's kind of a cultural cliche, I don't really feel that we get or give enough of a recognition to the critical importance that Roswell really was about. So let me leave Roswell behind here when we talk about crash retrievals. And I just want to talk a little bit more about some of Leonard Stringfield's witnesses. And this is very interesting because this is not something that you really hear that much these days. Nevertheless, I personally consider Stringfield's legwork to be some of the most important that has ever existed in the history of looking into crash retrievals. The problem with it is that it doesn't always refer to specific crash retrievals, but I'll just give you a flavor. Once Stringfield's book came out in 1977, people started coming to him. And not always coming to him. Sometimes he would just ferret things out. This is how a lot of the research happens. Like you go to one lead, and that lead leads you to someone else, and that leads you to someone else, and then you get your story. A lot of Stringfield's work was like that. Probably the most vivid, in my view, was his ongoing relationship with a particular doctor who at the time, this is around 1980 or so, was living in the New York City area. Stringfield interviewed him multiple times, and this doctor talked quite explicitly about his multiple conducting of autopsies of alien bodies. So we're talking again 1980. Now Stringfield never gave up the identity of this doctor. And I wrote quite a lot about this actually in volume 2 of UFOs and the National Security State. And what really happened is that Stringfield continued to try to cultivate this man. That guy just shut down. And it was very evident, at least for me looking back on it, that this man was shut down by powerful powerful voices that made him shut down and stop being a useful witness to Stringfield. But Stringfield talked to a lot of other people as well, sometimes direct individuals or sometimes the spouse of a deceased military person. That was common as well. One who witnessed 9 alien bodies at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base back in 1966. They were 4 feet tall. The witness was told that there were actually 30 bodies at the base in total. 30 non-human extraterrestrial bodies at the base. He was told that a craft was at the base. He was told that at certain military bases, there were mobile units that were in a constant ready state to recover downed UFOs. And indeed, we know in our history of something known as Project Moondust. Project Moondust, pardon me, was a program we know about it. There are declassified documents that we have from 1961 discussing the formation of this project known as Moondust that was charged with recovering space debris that was distinct from Russian or Soviet or any other national debris, because one of the things that they recovered was unidentified flying objects, as distinct from Soviet craft and so forth. So we know that they were out there specifically looking for downed UFOs. Anyway, there was another very interesting witness that Stringfield cultivated. This was a radar specialist who had been assigned at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, back in 1953. One of the most intriguing stories, in my view. So this man spoke to Stringfield many years later, and he said, I had the strangest thing happen to me way back then. I was brought into a military theater, me and just a small number of other soldiers, and we were shown a movie film of a crashed UFO in a desert. We were shown the interior of the craft. We were shown dead alien bodies inside a tent. We watched this for a little while. Then the film ended. The lights in the movie theater went up, and we were just told to leave. We were never given a debriefing on what the heck we just saw. And he said, like about 2 weeks later, I was approached by an intelligence officer on the base who said, "Remember that movie you saw? Forget it. It was a hoax." And apparently it stuck with this man. I've had my own theory about this, and I've just wondered if you are operating a program, a super secret program that had to do with crash UFOs, and maybe you were doing some recruiting. Maybe you wanted to know, how would these individuals react to this type of information? My guess is that radar specialist didn't pass the test. Maybe he talked about it to a buddy. Maybe he didn't react in a calm way. Who knows? But that's my guess. We'll never know. Another of Stringfield's contacts was a contractor at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base sometime during the 1960s who said that he saw 7 alien bodies under conditions of extreme security. Quite a few of these others. One other that I'll just mention here, a lieutenant colonel talked about intimate knowledge about underground installations, in this case, specifically at Fort Hood in Texas, and many other remote military bases with squadrons of unmarked helicopters that were dispatched to areas of UFO activity, including airlift operations. There's a lot of these types of stories that Stringfield came across in his career. He caught a lot of criticism from some very conservative researchers, I would say, who said, look, we need proof, we need names, we need fill in the blank. Which, yeah, we get that. But, you know, and I'm often critical as well of people who will say that they're a whistleblower and that they've done this or done that and so forth. And we should be skeptical. We should be careful. But Stringfield was a different sort of person. Stringfield, in my view, was a careful, very, very meticulous researcher. And everyone who knew Leonard Stringfield knew he had integrity. And they knew he was really smart. They knew he was actually a skilled investigator who knew how to ask good questions. And that he simply had to be careful about the anonymity of the people who came to him. It's as simple as that. Leonard Stringfield never made any money off of these claims, never tried to either, by the way, and nor did any of his witnesses. So when you look at the big picture of all of this, I think that these are factors to consider in the validity of Leonard Stringfield's testimony. Let me move on a little bit. There's the fascinating, and I mean absolutely fascinating, connection between, I guess, really let's say 4 individuals. Their names are, 2 of them are Canadian, Arthur Bray and Wilbert Smith, as well as Dr. Robert Sarbacher and Dr. Eric Walker. And just allow me very briefly to mention this little story. It's a fascinating story of investigation and crashed UFOs. So back in 1950, Wilbert Smith, who was a Canadian government official and a scientifically trained man and an exceptionally intelligent man, and I know this having read through his personal papers in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, where you can go there yourself and read through them. Anyway, Smith was a highly, highly sophisticated man who was fascinated with UFOs, believed they were real. In September of 1950, he was down in Washington, D.C., as a representative of the Canadian government, visiting with Canadian officials at the Canadian Embassy, and making a point to speak, to make the rounds, I guess you could say, to look into this flying saucer phenomenon. He wrote a memo back to his government, which was secret and classified for many years, came out in the 1970s, in which he described to his government that the United States government, and he got this information after speaking with a high-level U.S. scientist who was unnamed in the memo, that UFOs were the most highly classified subject in the U.S. government, rating higher even than the hydrogen bomb. And in 1950, you wouldn't think that there'd be anything higher rated than the hydrogen bomb, but this was. Now, who was the magical scientist, the mystical scientist that Wilbert Smith spoke to? Well, no one knew for years, until a man named Arthur Bray, going through Wilbert Smith's archives, found the handwritten notes from that meeting in September of 1950. And the name that he found was Dr. Robert I. Sarbacher. Robert Sarbacher was a super brilliant scientist who was very highly regarded in the United States defense establishment back at that time, and happened to still be alive in the 1980s when all of this was coming out. By the way, Arthur Bray, I was fortunate to meet him a little over a decade ago, and I can tell you this was a very, very fantastic, excellent researcher, and he's the kind of researcher that really keeps the UFO field alive, because there's, we don't have anything without those individuals who are willing to go into the archives and find these types of little pieces of gold, which is really what this was. Anyway, so Bray's research led to Sarbacher, and several people then went to look for Robert Sarbacher, who happened to be living in Florida at the time. One was Stanton Friedman, but the guy who really got Sarbacher to talk was a researcher named William Steinman. Steinman did a lot of it, very interesting work back at that time, and had several phone conversations with Sarbacher and got Sarbacher to write a 2-page, single-space, typewritten letter that details all of this, not all of this, but a lot of it, confirmed his meeting with Smith, and said, as a matter of fact, yes, not only did I tell this to Wilbert Smith, that UFOs were the highest rated subject in the US government, but there were crash retrievals of UFOs, and he said that he personally analyzed more than one landing site. Wow. Sarbacher died very suddenly in, I believe it was 1984. It might have been the end of 83. Before he died, he led researchers to one last person. He said, look, I wasn't directly involved with a lot of these studies, but I'll tell you who the guy who was. His name was Dr. Eric Walker. Eric Walker was still alive. Eric Walker is a fascinating man who had, for many years, been the president of Penn State University. But really what made him important is that he was head of one of the most powerful military think tanks in the country, called the Institute for Defense Analyses. He was also a friend of President Dwight Eisenhower. Anyway, Eric Walker, very powerful scientist, is accosted by a number of UFO researchers. One of them, by the way, is still kicking and still doing research, and that's Grant Cameron of Canada. But a number of other researchers found Walker as well, including William Steinman and others. And, by the time they got to Walker, it was the late 1980s, and the MJ-12 controversy was just coming out. And my feeling is that this kind of shook Walker a little bit. And I think that is the reason why, for at least the first significant period of time when he would talk to these various researchers, he confirmed a tremendous amount. Crash retrievals, yes. Recovery of bodies, yes. He attended meetings concerning UFO crash retrievals and recovery of bodies, confirmed that MJ-12 or some organization exactly like it did exist, and told one researcher, Steinman, he says, listen, you better just stop right now, because you are delving into an area that you can do absolutely nothing about. Leave it alone. Wow. By the way, I had a personal conversation many years later with William Steinman. And, he's not doing UFO research very actively these days, but there is no question. You talk to Steinman for 5 minutes and this guy was absolutely 100% right on and honest. But it wasn't just Steinman. Grant Cameron and T. Scott Crane, who I've also known for many years, were two other individuals involved in researching this. Then suddenly Walker just stopped talking. Enough with the phone calls. He made himself unavailable. But think about how fascinating that circuitous research path was, and how it led to all these little pieces of investigative gold. That's why I think we need to take the crash retrieval phenomenon very seriously. And we need to understand that when something that important goes down, of course, you have to assume that the world's most powerful military is going to be on top of that. And they are going to prevent access to the site. They are going to make sure that the corporate dominated media complex with which they are intimately allied is never going to allow this information to come out in a legitimate way. Of course, we must expect that, and that is precisely what's happened. But we also have the leaks, and it's not one leak, it's not 10 leaks, it's not 20 leaks, it's scores and scores of leaks. They don't stop. There's Bob Lazar. People have different opinions about Bob Lazar, but one thing that is worth bearing in mind, Bob Lazar claimed to have had a brief assignment at a place he called S4, just south of Area 51, out in the middle of nowhere in Nevada, and we've all heard the story. One thing you may want to remember, and Lazar was there in 1988 and early 89, he says there were 9 extraterrestrial vehicles that were there. They were beautiful. He called them the sports model, or at least one in particular was the sports model. Classic, like the Billy Meyer type of flying saucer that everyone's seen pictures of. But he pointed out, he says, I got to look in it, inside at one time, and it was way too small for any human being to operate that thing. It wasn't made for someone our size. And by the way, investigative journalist George Knapp of KLAS TV in Las Vegas, in the subsequent years after he broke Lazar's story, talked to, I think he said most recently to me, at least 24 additional Area 51 Groom Lake insiders, who all of which corroborated significant parts of Bob Lazar's claims. One of them said he saw a disc under a tarp at Groom Lake, but none of these people were willing to talk publicly. All were scared off. And by the way, Lazar did know the famous Dr. Strangelove. I'm talking about Edward Teller. You know, Lazar said he had met Teller when he was at Los Alamos National Labs back in the early 80s. People said, no, that's not true. Was true. And there's a video, actually, of Teller being accosted about this. And you see he's very upset. And he just says, look, I don't know Bob Lazar. All this is fine. I probably met him. I might have said to somebody I met him and I liked him after I met him. And if I liked him, but I don't remember him. I mean, you're trying to force questions on me. I simply won't answer. And he stormed out of the room. Thanks, Dr. Strangelove. Lazar was the real deal. And, you know, over the years, I myself caught some hell from other researchers because they said, oh, Dolan's too credulous. He believes Lazar's cock and bull story. Sorry. But I do believe it. And I know I'm not the only one who believes it. I don't say that every single element of Lazar's story is exactly true. I don't know how good his memory is. Lazar himself seems to have been subjected to some kind of intense interrogation at one point. He was arrested. Keep in mind, when he was taking his friends out to watch the aircraft, the craft, I should say, that he knew were out flying over there on schedule. I mean, how did he know these things anyway? Anyway, that's Lazar. There's the story of Ben Rich of Lockheed Skunkworks. And Ben Rich, another fascinating little tidbit into all of this. You know, first of all, there's the letter that Rich, we know, absolutely did write back in 1986. And in fact, it was in response to a letter from John Andrews, who himself was kind of legendary over at Lockheed. Andrews said, look, what's the story? We know about Sarbacher's letter, which had been making the rounds. And he said, what's the story with UFOs that we make and UFOs that they make? Do you have an opinion on this? They explicitly got into the us versus theirs discussion about UFOs. That's really interesting to have the head of Skunkworks participate in this. And but Rich says, look, I'm a believer in both options. And he wrote about UFOs as unfunded opportunities, underlining the UFO, unfunded opportunities. What's that all about? That's a cryptic note. You got to keep in mind, Rich was a CEO of a powerful division in one of the world's most powerful firms. They don't just go out and talk, you know, candidly to anyone when it's in writing. All right. But you've got that. I've always interpreted unfunded opportunities as crash retrievals. You know, you don't have to pay for them. It's unfunded. It's a nice opportunity. Heck, yes, it is. Absolutely. So that's Ben Rich. And of course, there's statements that Ben Rich made toward the end of his life to journalist James Goodall, who talked quite explicitly about Rich being very, very candid about the reality of UFOs and extraterrestrials. So there's that. There's the statement of late Colonel Philip Corso, another controversial individual. Corso's book is riddled with all kinds of factual mistakes, super easy to pick apart. His book, The Day After Roswell. And that's a given. I remember going through it the first time thinking, good, it was just one eye roll mistake after another. But as I learned years later, Corso wrote that book. He didn't really have benefit of a word processor. He hand wrote, and he was practically deaf. He was, I think, honestly, not really inclined to listen very carefully, and he just wrote from memory. And I think it's true that memories, as you get older, are not what they were when you're younger. I really believe that is true. So we have to take some of this with a grain of salt. But the question that I would ask is someone's memory so unreliable at that point that the most fundamental statement they make, which they make, by the way, in great detail, is that honestly to be dismissed out of hand? Corso stated that back in 1961, he was chief of the Pentagon's Foreign Technology Desk in Army Research and Development. Well, he was. And he had a job that was absolutely, totally confirmable. He also had a very excellent reputation through the 1990s for being a stand-up guy within the military. He was a liaison to Senator Strom Thurmond. He was the military liaison for Thurmond, who actually thought so highly of Corso that he wrote the foreword to his first edition of his book until he realized, oops, it's about UFOs, and had to retract it. But Corso talked about the reverse engineering of ET artifacts that led to things like particle beam devices and fiber optics and lasers and integrated circuit chips and even Kevlar and a lot more. And that's Corso. And then he died, by the way. He died a year after that book came out, very suddenly. And I'm not saying there was anything untoward about that, but he did die almost immediately after that book came out. Then there's Edgar Mitchell, a man that I knew, had a number of conversations with him, had breakfast with him on one occasion, and chatted with him on a number of other occasions. Edgar Mitchell was always very kind to me. He actually was the first major name ever to endorse any of my books. And in fact, he endorsed my first 3 books, and I was always grateful for that. And I think he was sincere in those endorsements. But anyway, the real thing about Edgar Mitchell is he spoke to me personally and actually spoke publicly a few times about his knowledge, not speculation, not I think this is the case, but knowledge, explicit confirmation, he said, from 2 ultra elite members of the United States national security community about how at deeply classified levels we had in our possession alien bodies and alien technology studied in deep secrecy. Now, I'm just going to say, you're an Apollo astronaut, you went to the moon. Who is not going to want to cultivate a relationship with you? Of course, Edgar Mitchell could have spoken to anyone he wanted to. He had almost complete access to the highest levels of the establishment. And he was able to get these 2 explicit confirmations. I myself had a conversation with another scientist of nearly equally high stature, and I have never given this man's name up, not until he gives me permission, but who told me separately, independently, and this is a guy absolutely in a position to know, who just confirmed to me, same thing. He said at deeply classified levels, we have scientists who have in their possession alien technology, and practically whispered, and at least one body that I personally know about. And I had a conversation with him about that as well. And this is a scientist that I respect his need for at least quiet anonymity about the matter at this point. Maybe at some other point I will I'll go public with it, but that's that. The other thing I just want to mention, now I want to get into, like, how do these things come down? Why do they come down? I mentioned Ryan Wood's book, Magic Eyes Only. Unfortunately, this is not available on Amazon, but I believe if you go to majesticdocuments.com, which is his website, I think he still sells it there. It's a very fine book. I highly recommend it. As I mentioned, he had 75 encounters that he wrote about, not all of which at the highest level of credence. I think he listed 17. I would put the number a little bit higher. But one thing that I want to stress here, independent of UFO crashes, is the long history of military confrontation, and not just military confrontation, but military close calls between our fighter jets and our aircraft and these objects. All right. And my feeling is that these ongoing encounters would naturally make crashes of UFOs and recoveries probably more likely. And just in terms of close military encounters, I've made a long list of describing a number of these, and there's quite a few. This is just a small segment from that I've collected from the late 1970s, and I'll just mention, 1975, you've got overflights by unknown objects, unknown to this day, over U.S. and Canadian sensitive military bases. It's never been explained. 1976, you have the famous Iranian F-4 encounters where two fighter jets try to engage in this very, very unusual object indeed. Early 1977, March 7th to be exact, a French Mirage fighter attempted to intercept radar visual of a UFO. French government report about it. This was a bright object approaching the jet at high speed. There was the same year, in June of 77, a Portuguese Air Force encounter with the UFOs. Dark object approaches. The pilot loses power and control of the plane, nearly crashes, regained control of the aircraft at treetop level. There's so many of these. I could go on. Late 1978, two Chilean F-5s on a standard training mission right on the Chilean coast off the Pacific Ocean. Sent from Cerro Morena Air Force Base, basically squared off with an enormous UFO, tracked on their airborne radars independently, both of them, as well as ground-based radar, giving the return of 10 aircraft carriers, 10, before it instantly took off at bullet speed over the Pacific Ocean and was gone. Good God. My point is that there were, and that's just a small sliver of the late 70s. Speaking of the late 70s, I highly credit a case that Ryan in his book did not credit very much, but I do. And that's the shooting of what appears to be an alien being at Fort Dix Army Base / McGuire Air Force Base. This is in New Jersey in January 1978. And I don't really have time to go into all the details. I think I may do this as a separate live stream in the future. But, and I believe this particularly on the research of my friend George Filer. George is still alive. He was stationed at the time at McGuire Air Force Base as Deputy Director of Intelligence for the 21st Air Force. And Filer is one of several witnesses that have gone on the record about this. One was a man under the pseudonym of Jeffrey Morse, but Jeffrey Morse spoke at length with Leonard Stringfield and the late Richard Hall, who both considered him incredibly credible, if that's a phrase, incredibly reliable, I guess I should say. Anyway, an alien being supposedly was shot dead at McGuire Air Force Base following the crash of a UFO. And on and on and on it goes. So, and by the way, this isn't simply the United States doing this. The Soviet Union, now Russia, but back in the days when it was the Soviet Union, had many cases where pilots encountered UFOs and where they were initially ordered to shoot, but they eventually stopped that because too many of their own fighter pilots were crashing and a couple of fatalities as a result. So the new order came to be evade the UFOs. And we see this, by the way, in some very amazing UFO encounters in the Soviet Union during its last years in the 1980s and early 90s. But the point was that the Soviets recognized that the Americans were much more aggressive relating to UFOs. This is in the words of a Soviet officer by the name of Sokolov, who spoke, excuse me, I just have a little thing in my eye here. There we go. Who spoke about this. And you have the Soviet Deputy Minister of Defense, a man named Ivan Tretyak back then, who confirmed in 1990 that fighter interceptors had encountered UFOs in Soviet airspace and so on. By the way, Sokolov's first name was Boris. He was a colonel in the Soviet Ministry of Defense. Soviet Union had at least one very famous crash retrieval at a place called Dolan in 1986. And by the way, in the more recent years, in the 1990s and in the 21st century, this appears to have continued, at least in the sense that fighter jets were chasing after UFOs in U.S. airspace. I have a case from March of 1994. The Alabama Air National Guard F-4 exploded in mid-flight over Heard County, Georgia. The county firefighters stated that just before the explosion, the F-4 was chasing a missile-like or cigar-shaped UFO. It was gray, silver-colored, about a third to half the size of the F-4 in the words of the witness. So Air Force explanation is that the mishap was caused by bad welds to the aircraft, but you've got a UFO encounter there. In 1996, same type of more encounters over Scott Air Force Base near Evanston, Indiana. An F-15 was chasing a UFO. Lots of witnesses. They're describing this as a strange orange ball of light in the sky, moving very slowly, that then just suddenly accelerated, split into 4 or 5 smaller globes, which vanish one by one, and they see this F-15 in pursuit. And we have the very widely witnessed jet interceptor case of F-16s pursuing UFOs just outside of the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. in July of 2002. I spoke myself to 2 of those witnesses, highly credible. What I just would say is there's more than sufficient evidence and documentation to establish significant interest by military authorities in these UFOs, and interceptions and military close calls have been a constant feature of the UFO phenomenon to the present day, which leads me to think that a number of crash retrievals, pardon me, are not actually all that outrageous to think. So how many crash retrievals are we talking? Maybe 20, maybe more, maybe less. But even if it's 10, let's say it's only 10, you take the top 10 cases, okay? So in 55, how many years now? No, my goodness. Let's say we've had 10 crash retrievals since the early 1940s. So we're talking nearly 80 years, let's say 77, 78 years. That's one crash every, 7 years, let's say, right? So is that a lot? Well, I started to wonder about this in comparing to our aviation crashes. And, if you try to look up aviation statistics, the first thing you're going to find, in fact, the first 20 things you're going to find, is how unbelievably safe air travel is. This is including if you're trying to find actual statistics. Turns out it's actually not that difficult, not that easy, to find explicit, reliable numbers of aviation crashes over the years. I really wanted to know this. So based on the overall numbers, what I'm finding is that the odds of being in a plane crash is about 1 in 11 million. So yeah, it's pretty safe. Glad to know that, because Tracey and I fly quite a lot these days, and I want to know that my airplane is safe. That's good. However, it's also true that we fly everyone, everywhere, every day in this world. And it turns out that while aviation safety is at an all-time high, the last year I could get information on was, I think, 2013. I read an article in The Guardian, of all places, that had some information on this, that said, I think in 2013, it was 81 aviation accidents, according to the International Air Transport Association. This was below the 5-year average of 86 accidents per year, and was the equivalent of an accident for every 2.4 million flights. So that's really good. The same article mentioned that 2 decades earlier, there were around 2,000 deaths and 250 crashes per year. That's kind of important to me. So as late as the 1990s, in our global aviation, according to The Guardian, you could expect about 250 crashes per year, killing about 2,000 people every year in aviation crashes, despite the fact that it's very safe. Again, we fly enough people that there are crashes happening. Well, 250 years, nearly one a day, right? It's like it's two every 3 days. And another thing that I learned is that in the history of world aviation, there have been, this is Wikipedia now, 548 crashes involving 50 or more fatalities. And the first crash involving fatalities was 1908. That's 110 years ago. And so that comes out to a very, very neat 4.98 crashes per year involving 50 or more fatalities. In other words, 548 crashes over 110 years, that's almost exactly 5 per year that involve 50 or more fatalities. All right. So all I'm saying here is that we ourselves, despite the incredible safety of commercial aviation, by the way, those numbers do not include military aviation, obviously, like warfare takes those numbers and completely on orders of magnitude beyond what I've just said to you. But our standard commercial aviation does have many crashes every year. Now, let's talk about UFOs. Nobody knows the genuine infrastructure behind the UFO phenomenon, how big it is, how active it may be, or the details of the encounters between these objects and the various militaries of the world. It seems to me that there's good reason to believe that there is a little bit of trouble in paradise, so to speak, and that there's a definite confrontational relationship, if not outright hostilities, between at least some of the global militaries, i.e. the United States, and these other objects. So there is reason to understand why at least some of those, every once in a while, may come down and be recovered. So when I hear these hypotheticals about, well, we just don't, it doesn't make sense why there would be all of these crashes from such advanced technology. Well, I think there's part of the reason. Now, granted, I'm speculating just as much as anyone else might be speculating here. But I would say that there is a very, very strong investigative foundation for the belief that UFO crash retrievals have happened multiple times. And if I were really to guess, I would probably guess more than 20. But again, I'm just guessing here. There are a few cases that are very strong. And then there's a lot of, let us say, other testimony, more generalized, that is strongly supportive of that conclusion. So there you have it. I think UFO crash retrievals not only are a reality, but are a very serious part of the undercurrent of our modern history. In other words, this is something that's been going on for a long time and is very important. And no one talks about it, at least not openly. We know very, very little, if really almost nothing, about UFO crash retrievals that may have happened over the past decade or two. The information really does dry up. And I don't think it's because they're not happening. I think it's because the global system of domination over, incredible to say this in the age of the internet, but over a centralized global media system is greater than ever before. We've got alternative media. You're participating in it right now. But it doesn't seem yet to have been able to crack the mainstream corporate establishment narrative that continues to dominate our world, in which UFOs, at least as a part of alien whatever they are, don't exist. Crash retrievals haven't happened. Where are they? Are they way out there? at safe distance, far, far away. They're never down here. They're not interacting with us in any way. And that's the narrative that we continue to hear. And it's just not true. We're living in a fantasy world. It's a fantasy world imposed upon us. And it really is the job of every person who cares about truth to do their very level best at piercing those fabrications and waking up to the reality that not only are we not alone in this universe, we are not alone in this civilization. With that, I would like to bring my wife back on to join me. How about that?
All right. We might be having a full crash. If you guys, if anyone is still getting us, can you let us know?